109 American officers trapped deep inside enemy territory. A tunnel nearly 60 feet long dug in absolute silence. And the tools? A tablespoon, a broken pocketknife, and the bare hands of a Pennsylvania schoolteacher who refused to accept defeat. This is not fiction. This actually happened. In 1864, inside the most heavily guarded prison in the Confederacy, a Union colonel named Thomas Ellwood Rose organized the largest mass escape of American officers in the entire Civil War. And he did it by digging a hole under the prison walls, using tools that would seem ridiculous if they hadn't worked. This is the story of how 109 men escaped from hell, how 59 of them made it home, and how a quiet, methodical schoolteacher became a legend among prisoners of war, even though almost no one knows his name today. You are about to hear one of the most extraordinary escapes in American military history. And it all started with a tablespoon. Before we enter Libby Prison, we need to understand who Thomas Ellwood Rose was, because the Libby escape was not the work of a career soldier, a reckless adventurer, or a comic book hero. It was the work of a schoolteacher. Rose was born in 1830 in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The son of a middle-class family, he studied, graduated, and became a schoolteacher. He married a woman named Lydia, had children, and lived a quiet, respectable life in a rural community. Nothing about him suggested he would become one of the great names in the history of military escapes. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Rose volunteered. Not out of military ambition, not for glory. He simply believed in the Union cause, preserving the United States, ending slavery, keeping the country whole. Rose joined the Pennsylvania Infantry and, over time, rose through the ranks on merit. He was not a military academy officer. He did not come from West Point. He had no political connections. He was a natural leader, the kind soldiers respect, because he shared the same sacrifices they did. In September 1863, Rose was promoted to colonel of the 77th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment. 2 months later, at the Battle of Chickamauga, one of the bloodiest of the war, fought in Georgia, he was captured by Confederate forces. Chickamauga was a disaster for the Union. General William Rosecrans's army was soundly defeated by the forces of Braxton Bragg and James Longstreet. Thousands of Union soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Among the prisoners was Thomas Rose. The capture was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for months. Rose was sent first to Richmond, the Confederate capital, and from there to Libby Prison. He arrived there in late 1863 along with other captured officers, and the first thing he saw when he entered that building was the despair stamped on the faces of the prisoners already there. Libby was no ordinary prison. It was a machine for grinding men down. Libby Prison stood in Richmond, Virginia, on the banks of the James River. The building had originally been a tobacco and supply warehouse, built by a merchant named Luther Libby, hence the name. When the war began and the Confederacy needed places to hold Union prisoners, the warehouse was confiscated and converted into a prison. The building had 3 floors, plus a basement. It was made of brick with thick walls and barred windows. The front faced a busy Richmond street. The back faced the river. The location was strategic. It sat in the heart of the enemy capital, surrounded by Confederate soldiers, military depots, and rebel government buildings. Escaping from there meant not just getting out of the building, but crossing an entire city controlled by the enemy. The conditions inside Libby were appalling. Union officers, men who, by the rules of war at the time, were supposed to receive decent treatment, were crammed into overcrowded rooms. There were not enough beds. Prisoners slept on the hard floor, on dirty straw when there was any. The Virginia winter cold came through the broken windows. In summer, the heat was suffocating. Food was scarce and of terrible quality. Prisoners received minimal rations, hard cornbread, a piece of salted meat when available, dirty water. Many men suffered from dysentery, typhoid fever, pneumonia. The death rate was staggering. Bodies were removed daily. But there was something even worse than hunger and disease: the crushing boredom, the sense of powerlessness, the humiliation of being an American officer confined like an animal, not knowing if he would ever be exchanged or freed. Prisoner exchanges between the Union and the Confederacy had been suspended in 1863 due to political disputes, which meant the men in Libby had no prospect of getting out. To make matters worse, the Confederate guards at Libby were known for their cruelty. The prison commandant, Major Thomas P. Turner, was a harsh and unpredictable man. He maintained brutal discipline, punished prisoners for any infraction, and made a point of reminding everyone that they were in the heart of the Confederacy and that no one was coming to save them. This was the environment Thomas Rose walked into in late 1863. And while most men tried simply to survive, ration food, care for the sick, wait for a prisoner exchange that might never come, Rose looked around and made a decision that set him apart from almost everyone else. He decided he was getting out. It didn't matter how. It didn't matter how long it took. He was getting out of Libby. Rose began to observe everything. This was his nature, the methodical schoolteacher who analyzes a problem before acting. He studied the guards' routine, the patrol schedules, the blind spots, the moments of distraction. He studied the building structure, the thickness of the walls, the angle of the windows, the position of the staircases. He studied the other prisoners, who could be trusted, who had useful skills, who had the courage for a dangerous undertaking. The conclusion Rose reached was both simple and terrifying. The only way out of Libby was underneath. The windows were barred, the doors were guarded, the roof was inaccessible. But the floor of the east basement of the building, offered a possibility. If someone could dig a tunnel from the basement to the street, they could emerge outside the guarded perimeter. The problem was that the tunnel would need to be at least 50 to 60 feet long, pass under a brick wall, and end somewhere the escapees could exit without being seen by the guards. Oh, and there was another detail. The prisoners had no tools, no shovels, no pickaxes, nothing that could dig through packed earth. They had only their hands, and bare hands were not going to dig a 60-foot tunnel, Rose thought. He observed more, and he began to collect what was available. A tablespoon stolen from the kitchen during food distribution, a broken pocketknife that one prisoner had hidden in his boot, pieces of wood pried from loose floorboards, a chunk of iron found in the basement. Each item was tiny, almost pathetic as a digging tool. But Rose gathered them all together and looked at that pile of scrap the way an engineer looks at a blueprint. He didn't need good tools. He needed silent tools. Because the sound of digging would alert the guards in seconds. Silence. That would be the key to everything. Rose carefully recruited a small group of trusted officers. These were men he observed for weeks, assessing their character, their discretion, their ability to keep their mouths shut. A single informant, a single prisoner who traded information for favors from the guards, and they would all be dead. The group included names like Major A.G. Hamilton, Colonel Henry Hobart, Major George H. Fitzsimmons, among others. Rose was the undisputed leader, not by rank, but by sheer force of will. He inspired those men with an unshakable certainty. We are getting out of here. The point chosen for the dig was the east basement of the building. It was a dark, damp area infested with rats, which the guards rarely inspected. Access to the basement was restricted. In theory, prisoners were not allowed down there. But Rose and his men discovered a way to reach the basement through a hidden passage behind an old fireplace. The digging began, and digging is a generous word for what those men did. They took turns in shifts. One man dug while others kept watch. The digger used the tablespoon to scrape away dirt, the pocket knife to loosen stones, bare hands to pull out roots. The work was slow, painful, exhausting. Every inch of earth removed was a victory. But there was an immediate problem: what to do with the dirt. If the guards saw fresh dirt piled up anywhere, they would discover the tunnel in minutes. Rose devised an ingenious system. The dirt was spread on the basement floor and trampled until compacted. Another portion was hidden inside the prisoners' clothing and discreetly dumped in other parts of the building. Some men carried dirt in their pockets and let it trickle out slowly as they walked, like sand running from an hourglass. It was ant-like work, but it worked. The tunnel progressed, 6 inches a night, 8 inches on a good night, 2 inches when they hit a large rock. The air inside the tunnel was suffocating. There was no ventilation. Men emerged from the dig covered in dirt, coughing, their hands bleeding. But they came back the next night. Rose was always there. He dug more than anyone. He encouraged, he planned, he solved problems. When the tunnel hit a brick wall underground, probably an old foundation, Rose did not back down. He used the broken pocket knife to scrape the mortar between the bricks, one by one, until he opened a passage. It took days, but he got through. The tunnel was about 5 feet deep, wide enough for a man to crawl through, and just high enough to drag oneself on one's belly. It was claustrophobic, pitch black, damp, but it was a way out. After weeks of work, Rose calculated that the tunnel was now about 50 feet long. He estimated that only a few more feet remained to reach the other side of the street, where an abandoned shed could hide the exit. And then, in the first week of February 1864, Rose decided it was time. He couldn't wait any longer. At any moment, the guards could discover the operation. The men were exhausted. The moon was favorable, a cloudy night, no bright moonlight, exactly what they needed for a mass escape. The date was set, February 9th, 1864. What happened that night would enter American military history as one of the most audacious escapes ever carried out. Part 5. The Night of the Escape. On the night of February 9th, 1864, the tension inside Libby Prison was unbearable. Rose had informed a larger group of prisoners, not everyone, because the risk of betrayal was high, but a significant number. The news spread in whispers. Tonight. 109 Union officers prepared to escape. The plan was simple. Descend to the basement in small groups, enter the tunnel one at a time, crawl to the exit, emerge on the other side, and scatter through the city of Richmond. Each man would have to find his own way to Union lines, which were dozens of miles away. It was a risky plan, but it was the only chance they had. The escape began around 9 o'clock at night. Rose coordinated the exit. One by one, The men slid into the tunnel. The space was so tight that many had to remove their coats and shoes to squeeze through. They dragged themselves on their bellies in total darkness, feeling the cold earth pressing against their bodies. The air was heavy, almost unbreathable. Some men had panic attacks inside the tunnel, but their comrades pushed them forward. The tunnel emerged into an abandoned shed on the other side of the street. When the first men came out, they were stunned. They were in the open air. They were outside Libby. The street was dark, silent. The Confederate guards had noticed nothing. Over the following hours, 109 officers emerged from that hole in the ground. It was the largest mass escape from a Confederate prison in the entire Civil War. But the escape was not perfect. Around 2 in the morning, one of the last men to exit made enough noise to alert a guard. The alarm was raised. The Confederates stormed the basement and discovered the tunnel, still warm from the bodies that had passed through it. The escape ended there. The men still in line were recaptured immediately. Outside, the 109 escapees were scattered across Richmond. They split into small groups and tried to flee the city. Richmond was full of Confederate soldiers. Patrols roamed the streets. Tracking dogs were deployed. In the hours and days that followed, most of the escapees were recaptured, but not all of them. 59 officers made it to Union lines. 59 men who, without Rose's tunnel, would probably have died in Libby. Their freedom was the direct legacy of a Pennsylvania schoolteacher's determination, a man who refused to accept confinement. Thomas Rose was one of the recaptured. He almost made it. He was miles from Richmond, hiding in a swamp, a few days' walk from Union lines, when a Confederate patrol found him. The recapture was a devastating blow. After weeks of digging, leading, inspiring, Rose was back in enemy hands. The Confederates, furious about the escape, treated the recaptured men with redoubled brutality. Rose was sent to other prisons, Macon, Georgia, and later Charleston, South Carolina. Conditions in those prisons were even worse than Libby, but Rose survived. He spent the rest of the war in captivity, enduring hunger, disease, and abuse. When the war ended in April 1865, he was freed. Thin, sick, aged far beyond his mid-30s, but alive. Rose returned to Pennsylvania, to his wife Lydia and his children. He resumed his civilian life, but the Libby experience never left him. He felt he had an obligation to document what happened so that future American soldiers could learn from it. He wrote a detailed account of the escape. He described the techniques he used, how to choose the digging point, how to hide the dirt, how to maintain silence, how to organize the men, how to time the escape. It was one of the first art of escape manuals in American military history. Years later, these writings would be studied by intelligence and survival officers. Rose never sought fame. He did not write a sensational memoir. He did not go on a lecture tour. He simply returned to his quiet life and remained who he always was, a schoolteacher. But among Civil War veterans, among the men who had been in Libby, the name Thomas Ellwood Rose was spoken with reverence. He died in 1907 at the age of 77. He was buried with military honors in Doylestown Cemetery, Pennsylvania. His headstone mentions his military service, but says nothing of the tunnel, nothing of the 109 men who escaped, nothing of the dark nights in the Libby basement, crawling through the dirt with a tablespoon in his hand. But the men who survived because of him never forgot. The Libby Prison escape should be one of the most famous stories of the American Civil War. 109 officers escaping from a maximum security prison in the heart of enemy territory through a tunnel dug with spoons and pocket knives. 59 men reaching freedom. It's the kind of story Hollywood loves, the kind of story that should be in school textbooks. And yet, it isn't. Several factors contributed to Thomas Rose and the Libby escape falling into obscurity. First, the war itself ended in 1865 with the Union victory and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, events that monopolized national attention. Second, Rose was not a self-promoter. He didn't cultivate fame, didn't write a bestseller. His account remained in military archives, read by few. Third, in the decades that followed, the memory of the Civil War was dominated by narratives about famous generals: Grant, Lee, Sherman, Jackson, while the stories of ordinary men like Rose were buried in dusty archives. But there is another reason, more subtle. The Libby escape was not a military victory in the traditional sense. It didn't change the course of the war. It was a human victory over despair, over cruelty, over impossible circumstances. And human victories don't always get the spotlight they deserve in the history books. What Rose did at Libby transcended the war. He proved that the ingenuity, discipline, and determination of a leader can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. He showed that even when a man is locked up, starving, unarmed, and alone in the heart of enemy territory, he can still act, he can still fight, he can still win. The escape techniques Rose developed, silent digging, dirt dispersal, cellular organization, nighttime timing, became part of American military training. Prisoners of war in future conflicts from World War II to Vietnam would use principles that Rose and his men improvised in the darkness of a basement in Richmond. Thomas Rose has no movie, no statue, no national holiday, but he has something more important, a quiet legacy that saved lives and will continue to save lives as long as there are American soldiers who may one day need to escape captivity. There is something deeply American about the story of Thomas Rose. It's not the story of a superhero. It's not the story of a brilliant general or a visionary politician. It's the story of a schoolteacher who, confronted with hell, decided he would not accept his fate. He looked at a tablespoon and saw a tool of freedom. He looked at a dark basement and saw an escape route. He looked at a group of desperate men and saw a team. Rose did not escape alone. He took 109 men with him, and even though he was recaptured, even though he spent the rest of the war in other prisons, he never considered his effort a failure. 59 officers reached Union lines because of the tunnel he built. 59 lives that did not end in Libby. That is the measure of Thomas Rose. Not fame, not recognition, but the quiet, lasting impact of a man who, in the worst situation imaginable, decided to act. Libby Prison no longer exists. The building was demolished in the late 19th century. But if you go to Richmond today, you can see a plaque on the site where the warehouse once stood. It briefly mentions the escape. Very briefly. Most people walk past it without noticing. Now you know what happened there. Now you know the name of the man who made it possible. Thomas Ellwood Rose, schoolteacher, colonel, leader of the largest escape from a Confederate prison in the American Civil War. A man who proved that, sometimes, the most powerful weapon a soldier can have is not a rifle, not a sword, not a cannon. It's a tablespoon in the hands of someone who refuses to give up. History is full of stories that deserve to be told. The forgotten ones, the strange ones, The ones that make you stop and realize that the truth is often more extraordinary than anything we could make up. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Drop a comment below. I read them all, and I'd love to know what you think. There are a lot more stories waiting in the margins. Let's find them together. See you in the next one.